I look back on Sonic Mania's pre-release period, and I remember being so hyped for it. Leading up to the game's release, seeing promotional material showing off that Mega Drive era style and the return of playable Tails and Knuckles, not counting their Boom appearances, was just so warming to my cold, elder millennial, cynical blood pump. Classic Sonic was back, and built on that fancy retro engine that played those neat widescreen ports of Sonic 1, 2 and CD. T-Lopes was on board for the soundtrack, so we knew the music was going to be great. Studiopolis was the first level presented in the announcement trailer, and it looked like the most quintessential and most stylish Sonic level we'd seen in years. The pre-order trailer showed off some beautifully animated cutscenes and some early shots of Mirage Saloon. The hype was immeasurable. We were also shown some, not quite red flags, but more, I guess, amber flags? Reimagined classics. Nowadays, it's a constant bugbear for many of us that we keep seeing Green Hill Zone and Chemical Plant Zone returning, and at the time, for me, seeing them return in this game was kind of deflating after having seen them remade a few years prior in Sonic Generations, even before Forces and Frontiers compounded the issue of oversaturation. The thing is, I figured I'd look past that, as it was an anniversary game, and while we'd had a lot of great entries between 3K and Mania on Nintendo's handhelds, this was the first to play, look and feel like it was from that Mega Drive era since 3K, and hey, that was my era. I had some reservations, but yeah, I was excited. When I started up the game, I was so happy to hear that music, see the opening animation, and see that Sonic 2 sprite on my screen. When the game got properly going, I was over the moon to hear the Angel Island theme. I was intrigued by these new Egg Robo-like guys who I'd later learn are the hardboiled heavies. Then that purple stone, that damn Phantom Ruby, walked me out of my Sonic 3 Island paradise and put me back into Green Hill Zone. I was so mad that Angel Island wasn't an additional playable zone. Sure, we kind of got the skeleton of an act in the plus mode, but it's not enough. Fine, whatever. I was playing Green Hill Zone, and by now I'm sure most of us know the drill of Mania's reimagined classic levels. Just in case you don't though, the zone starts with a like-for-like layout of its original namesake, but then gradually differs the level and introduces different level mechanics, objects, and sometimes may even change the aesthetic a bit. It was a cool nostalgia buzz at the time. You'd also get a bunch of set pieces that would be referential too. Seeing the Death Egg robot as the Act 2 boss of Green Hill Zone was a pretty cool throwback at the time. There was a bunch of those throughout the game. Set pieces, I mean, that is. There was only one Death Egg robot. There were references put throughout the game. Like, if you look at the special stages, that Sonic model was totally Saturn era inspired, and that's pretty cool. Chasing those UFOs was pretty neat as well, as it was a nice little throwback to Sonic CD, and seeing Blue Sphere come back for the bonus stages was really cool. At the time, seeing all of these little nods, winks and references and returns to all of these different aspects of Sonic's history, it was really fun, and like, it shows that they did their homework. But more and more, I just kind of found that these little things just kind of, I guess, lost their buzz to me. Where this game shined most to me was really the new stuff. As mentioned, Studiopolis was my first impression of Mania, and experiencing it firsthand did not disappoint. After getting that nostalgia buzz from Green Hill and Chemical Plant, I was ready to see something new, and to be blunt, this is to date my favourite level in Mania, no question. It looks and sounds like what I'd expect from a 2D game on the 32X CD Tower of Power or the Saturn. It plays fluidly and oozes charm, and just has all the right kind of enemy designs, looks, aesthetics, and obstacles, and it's just the ideal level. This is what I'd been waiting for since the initial trailer. This was Sonic Mania. Then we go back to the past, and we're back in Flying Battery Zone. Now, at the time, we hadn't seen Sonic 3 and Knuckles get much acknowledgement since its Steam release, which is now delisted. Sure, we got Sky Sanctuary in Generations, but we hadn't got Sonic 3 and Knuckles in the Retro Engine. We hadn't got a 3D Classics version on the 3DS. Sonic 3 was just MIA for a bit, while Sonic 1 and 2 were still popping up everywhere. Of course, the story of that is well documented. Michael Jackson's estate, music rights, yada yada yada. Trust me, if you're curious about it, it is covered a lot online. After the Angel Island tease, it was cool to see some Sonic 3. I think the Sonic 3 and Knuckles stuff got a bit more of a response from me than the other reimagined zone, perhaps due to it being my personal favourite, or perhaps due to that aforementioned lack of exposure to 3K in that drought, which would persist from the official product until Sonic Origins. It was cool to see, at the time. This was kind of my reception throughout the game. The new stuff had me glued to my screen, while the reimagined levels were a neat trip to memory lane for the moment, and a fascination with regard to the new level designs and mechanics at play. On subsequent playthroughs, however, I found that the nostalgia hit just really wasn't hitting, and I found more and more that I was losing interest in the reimagined zones, while I was using level select on completed saves to access the 4 original zones. I recently attended the Sonic Symphony and got to hang out with my buddy Webster and meet Channel Pop for the first time, both great lads, and we started talking about the Green Hill oversaturation problem and how there's really a limit to how much that same tactic can be used before it stops getting a reaction, trying to get nostalgia constantly. It's like how a joke is less funny each time it's told, and a magic trick is less amazing each time something is pulled out of a hat. So, when a nostalgia hit no longer has any effect, what do we really have left from Sonic Mania? Well, honestly, Mania is still an orally and visually stunning game with very consistent level design. On paper, it's probably one of the best Sonic games ever. Mechanically, one can make a case that the reimagined levels may surpass the originals in some ways. Of course, a counter-argument could just as easily be made. For me, there's just something missing though. I can revisit Sonic 2, Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and Sonic Adventure so frequently. Hell, I can revisit 8-bit Sonic 1 occasionally too. In the decades they've been around, I've not come close to getting bored of these games yet. Sonic Mania on the other hand, I just don't play it anymore to that same extent. This run you see in footage from was the first time in about 2 or 3 years that I've done more than just hop into a quick level, while if I start 2 or 3K or Sonic Story on Adventure, I'm finishing the thing. While the reimagined levels aren't a one-to-one recreation of their original counterparts, and they do augment them somewhat, and add mechanics that weren't in those previous levels, they're still just effectively pastiches in so many ways. I find myself in these versions of these zones feeling like I'd rather just be in the originals. I look at the new zones and I just want more of them. At the Sonic Symphony World Tour, there's a Sonic Mania medley. This covers the tunes from the opening theme, Studiopolis, Press Garden, and Titanic Monarch. The only other track they could have used was Mirage Saloon, and that really hammered hard how much this game's identity is tied to a third of its levels. When Sonic Mania Plus came out, that feeling that we were just getting more of the same from this game was yet further cemented for me. Don't get me wrong, Ray and Mighty are fun characters, but when you look at how Knuckles changed the level layout somewhat, I kind of was hoping for that from them, but we didn't really get that with them. Don't get me wrong, the first batch of Mania level layouts are fun, and neat little additions like the bouncy goo in Chemical Plant Zone and things like that are quite neat, but I don't know. Just on top of that, the Mania Plus remixes are also fun, and the changed colour palette helps freshen up the feel of the game somewhat, in addition to that tag team mechanic, but it's just something missing for me. There's just something that just doesn't feel original. At least, when there is originality, it feels like there's not enough of it there. I remember when Mania was still relatively new out, I handed the controller to another friend of mine who's a bit more disenfranchised with today's gaming landscape than myself, and his response was, and I quote, "This game just feels like a ROM hack," end quote. And I completely understand where he's coming from. Outside of adding the drop dash, mechanically, Mania is effectively a lateral sidestep from Sonic 3 and Knuckles. We've still got the same elemental shields, for the most part the same movesets, and a lot of the level mechanics we'd already seen in prior titles, albeit perhaps not in the levels that they were placed in. And, it was well executed, and, that's the thing, the execution is good. I've seen several people argue that Mania should be considered the true Sonic 4, which, compared to the game that got the title Sonic 4, I get why you'd feel that way. And I don't know, I just feel like it's not exactly a true extension and evolution of the formula, which, obviously Sonic 4 isn't, but let's not get into a Sonic 4 rant right now. But I digress. I think Sonic Mania was lightning in a bottle. Right game, right time, right place. It was a well-designed and polished way to celebrate Sonic glory years as a former system seller, and a great way to introduce people to the franchise. It just doesn't do enough new though. To me, it's a cover album by a tribute band with a few of their own tracks in there. It's a very well done cover, and it does some neat things with how they do it and a bit of recontextualization, but I wanted to see this band do their own original album. Mania is great, and I appreciate the enjoyment I got from it and the work put in by a passionate team, but it just doesn't have the staying power of its inspirations for me. In the last couple of years, I've looked to other works from the fandom to look for that fresh feeling, typically with a focus on new levels. Sonic Triple Trouble 16-bit provided a fresh experience to me with how little experience I'd had with the 8-bit original, and the change felt somewhat more substantial from its 8-bit counterpart compared to Mania's reimaginings. This actually felt like it would be right at home on the Mega Drive thanks to Copeland's dedication to aiming for that sound and look. I think with how little Triple Trouble is in the cultural sphere of Sonic compared to the Mega Drive games, and how far this goes to separate itself from the 8-bit original, it stands apart very well from other games of its kind. I feel like if Sega were to do the whole thing of revisiting game levels again, I'd rather them do something like this, like recreate levels that we just haven't seen recreated and, do it in a way where it really does make them new. I mean, this was the kind of thing that people wanted from Sonic Generations on the 3DS to give a real tribute to that handheld games, but again, I digress. Personally though, I'm more in the camp of keeping levels new, even if they are kind of facsimiles of previous levels. I feel like Sonic and the Fallen Star was absolutely the breath of fresh air I was looking for in a lot of ways. It gave the 2D playstyle a fresh new vibe that felt like it was aesthetically inspired by the Jet Set Radio era of Sega. There was this back and forth level design, horizontally speaking, that took the vertical root split design of 2D Sonic and subverted how it works quite a bit. The music has a funky vibe, befitting of its visual aesthetic design. It feels like the shot in the arm I'd wanted to see from Sega for so long, especially with how 2D Sonic is handled. I could spend all day going into Sonic fan games, but to stay in scope, I'd better wrap up my final thoughts. Sonic Mania is a fun time, but I'm more likely to jump into Sonic Origins for my classic 2D Sonic fix. Well, actually, I'm more likely to use a decompilation or Sonic 3 Air, but that's another discussion. 6 years on from Sonic Mania, it's a game I outright overlook, and I think I'm far from alone in that. Let me know how you feel about Mania. With Sonic Superstars due out in a few weeks, while I have some reservations on it with a design focus on multiplayer co-op and an aesthetic I'm not entirely sold on, I'm very interested and hopeful for it to be that next step in experimentation for 2D Sonic. It's funny that Nintendo also seem to have avoided the new Super Mario Bros. Formula for the next 2D platformer, so both companies have been experimenting. It's 2023 and we have a new 2D and Sonic Mario game, both on the way respectively for their franchises, both with new things to show us. Perhaps where Sonic is concerned, Mania's success is to thank for showing 2D Sonic viability is still there, and for, help propping the franchise up. Maybe in another 6 years I'll look at Mania differently, but like I say, I enjoyed it at the time, but for now it remains unclear when I plan to visit it again. Thank you for watching.